Hello and welcome to the Sustainable Apparel Coalition's Drivers of Change podcast series. In this series, we speak to leading voices from within the textile, apparel and fashion supply chain, as well as external experts to discuss how industry can transform in order to tackle the climate crisis and address social challenges. We'll explore what's happening and what needs to happen if we are to create a more equitable, sustainable and resilient future for all. I'm your host, Lee Green, and I'm the Senior Director of Communications and Marketing at the Sustainable Apparel Coalition. Enjoy the show. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Liam Salter, founder and CEO of Reset Carbon, a company that is increasingly regarded as a leading practitioner in the emerging field of supply chain sustainability solutions, working with sectors such as apparel, electronics, and food and beverage to reduce their supply chain footprint. Liam, welcome and thanks for joining.
Hi, Lee. It's good to be here.
Thank you. So, conscious of time, I really do want to kind of talk about some of the noise, if I can use that phrase, around carbon at the moment. And I'm conscious that you focus on carbon and renewables, as well as water and waste. But can you kind of just give an overview of why you've chosen these three things? Are they all equal? And by that, I mean, if you look at column inches that something like carbon is getting at the moment, do we need to look at all of them? Is carbon the biggest one that needs to be solved? Bearing in mind that obviously water and waste, they seem to be on the rise, but definitely it's not getting the news coverage of something like carbon at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the recognition that we're way behind the curve on carbon has sort of sunk into a lot of sectors, and that I think is where the urgency comes from. And so that's prompted a lot of sort of target setting on carbon that you don't see on water and waste in the same way. So there's a lot more. The ambition level on carbon, which is kind of driven by the climate science, has pushed this issue to the front in the last couple of years, certainly. I think we have a business. The Reset business does the core carbon management stuff. We have a business called Act Renewable it's a joint venture that focus really on the renewable stuff. Obviously, these two are tightly interlinked, very synergistic. We find in the footwear and apparel supply chain, the water piece also follows quite closely. So we'll often look at water together with carbon and energy in the same sort of piece of analysis, because they're often driven by the same kinds of things. But waste, is a very different approach, and certainly the carbon bundle, if you like, is the one that a lot of people are focused on at the moment.
Okay, great, thank you. So obviously companies are now looking at science-based targets and setting these kinds of carbon reduction goals. In your experience, what do you think are the pitfalls companies often make when trying to set these goals? And do you have any top tips on how companies can actually set effective goals? I don't want to say realistic, but is it you have to set incremental steps? Is it just the big 2050 net zero? What's the best way about going about it?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing a lot of targets, and in apparel we've got Fashion Charter and SBTI. It's all kind of delivering goals of sort of 50% absolute reductions, supply chain wide, 2030-ish kind of level of ambition, right? So it's interesting that everybody's level of ambition is very similar. That's good. It means everybody's working, theoretically at the same pace. I think we've seen, well, obviously 2050 goals are on their own don't work, right? It's too far out. It's very, very hard to build a business strategy to 2050 alone. And even if you have a 2050 goal in practice, you're going to be looking at the 2031 as your priority for the next few years anyway. Mm-hmm. So I think that's sort of fairly clear. What I think is important is that when businesses are setting these goals, that they actually do a little bit of analysis first to give themselves a view on how they're going to achieve it. I think when people just throw out a number and then they've got no idea how to achieve it, and then they kind of go back into the business and start exploring that later, and they suddenly find, well, this is quite challenging, and we're not really sure if we've actually got the required levels of buy-in, then we have a problem, right? So we definitely advise companies to do a bit of modeling first, look at your business growth, think a little bit about, your products and give yourself some estimates of how you're going to get the reductions before you kind of go public with a target. And certainly in the market at the moment, there is a bit of a concern around the net zero issue, and companies have set targets, but they're not really implementing them. And there's some reports coming out, Carbon Market Watch and stuff like that, that are throwing question marks up. So I think, companies need to anticipate that the market is just going to ask more and more questions about how well you're doing and how you're doing it, not just the target, and be prepared for that by, having some plans in place before the target goes public.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I remember back in the summer last year, I was at an event, and a big CEO of a big international company kind of made a statement on stage, and the next day Bloomberg had the headline. I won't mention his name, but this CEO has no idea how his company is going to reach net zero. That was the premise of the headline. I think if we look at things like Scope 3 emissions, it feels like that is a big topic that a lot of companies seem to really struggle to understand how they can effectively measure that. And of course, you have to be able to sort that out if you're going to meet these net zero commitments. And I just wondered, do you get a lot of you need to help us on these Scope 3 emissions? Do companies find that Scope 1, Scope 2 kind of much more in their own wheelhouse and control, so it's a bit easier, and the Scope 3 thing is a real challenge? Or is it actually just everything's a challenge, or everything's manageable? It just needs to be processed the right way.
No, you're right. I think Scope 3 is definitely more challenging. And certainly, from the brand side, let's say, Scope 1 and 2 increasingly looks fairly straightforward for a lot of brands. And with Scope 3, I think what's interesting in footwear and apparel is, the work that AII, SAC have done, WRI and so on, sort of mapping out the opportunities. It's pretty clear what kind of needs to happen, right? So for Scope 3 to be targets to be hit, we've got to engage into carbon intensive manufacturing processes. That's especially the wet processing suppliers have got to be really drop. Those emissions have to drop considerably, and we've got to do something about emissions from raw materials. So cotton, polyester, those are the hotspots. So I think what's interesting is every brand kind of understands roughly where they need to focus in this sector. Mm-hmm. The question is, are you building out these programs into the right parts of your supply chain, and are you doing that ambitiously enough? And I wouldn't say you can easily point to any brand and say they're really on top of this yet. So you can definitely see that there are some brands that are going much deeper and have kind of thought this through a lot more, and where there are others that are just starting. So there is actually a pretty wide range of performance, even with companies with the same target. But those are the things that brands ought to be looking for, and people scrutinizing brands will be looking for. So are you doing polyester? What are you doing on cotton? What are you doing on mills, basically?
Yeah.
When it comes to manufacturers, it's much more of a Scope 1 and 2 question, because in a lot of the time, they don't really control the product upstream anyway. That comes from the brand. Mm-hmm. And certainly the focus of most manufacturer conversations right now is Scope 1 and 2.
Okay, cool. Thank you. So, I alluded to it slightly earlier, but there has been some criticism of science-based targets, carbon offset and carbon credits. So I just want to, what's your take on these? Is the criticism fair? Are there better scalable solutions out there? Or is this is where the science tells us we need to focus, and so that's where we should put our energy?
There's a couple of issues here. I think so. SBTI is a pretty complex program, doing some pretty technically quite difficult work. It's an NGO. It's scaling really rapidly. They had a huge jump in demand in the last sort of year and a half, 2 years. So a lot of what we see, I think, is sort of, organizational growth challenges. Most of what I think we see from SBTI, I don't think it's that big a deal. I don't think it really fundamentally impacts the strength of the approach or the methodology. I think when we look in general across all sectors, we see a convergence upon SBTI, actually, rather than people moving away from it. We see other standards and systems seeking to align. So not just in apparel, in a whole range of other sectors. So convergence around SBTI. Probably the challenge they do have comes back to the monitoring and reporting. They've been very light on that. We know a lot of companies have set SBTI targets and had those targets validated, and we're not sure what they're doing, and they haven't been asked to do any reporting. And historically, SBTI has often said was not really our responsibility. I think obviously they've changed their mind on that. But the MRV stuff is not expected until end of this year at the earliest. And given the concern in the market, that's pretty late actually. So they do need to kind of keep evolving and stay focused on a market that because they're now a lot more important than they used to be, is putting them under a lot more scrutiny. Carbon offsets are a totally different ballgame. I think there's been a long-running discussion about the uncertainties around offset quality and how companies should be using them. Actually, if you look at SBTI says don't use them to hit your targets. You can use them once you've hit your targets, but you've got to hit your targets yourself. And I think that's good advice. That's certainly the advice that we give to our customers. Is that if you're going to use offsets, you can only really credibly do that after you've demonstrated that you're driving the emissions down within your operations and your supply chain first, and the offsets kind of you can deploy on top of that. But if your primary strategy is around offsetting, or you're using offsetting to kind of hit important goals, I think that's pretty risky right now. And not SBTI compliant either, actually. Yeah. So offsets. A lot of our businesses in Asia, Asian businesses are very cautious on offsetting anyway. So we believe that there's still some discussion and improved work on sort of market standards in the voluntary offsetting space. We see it going on right now. A lot of conversation in that community. And we hope that that's going to result in a more credible regime going forwards that we can then encourage our customers to kind of relook at.
Great, thank you. So your organization, Reset, it also uses life cycle environmental footprint tools. So what's your take on these tools? How do they help? LCAs and things like that. Again, sometimes there are questions around them, whether they're valid or not, but just... what's your take on the performance of these types of tools, methodologies?
They're very valuable. I think we use them in particular to understand the differences in environmental performance between products, the improved environmental performance of new materials or processes. So LCA tools are great for sort of sizing the environmental benefits of new stuff coming into the market. We use them quite a lot with brands and manufacturers that have new products coming to market or new processes that they want to present to brands as more environmentally friendly. Again, there's a lot of methodology in here. They're getting more scrutiny these days. Previously they've been used in a fairly limited scale with individual products. Now, a lot of the LCA methodology can find itself into the corporate inventory as well, right? So into corporate reporting rather than just on individual products, the whole sort of business impact. And of course, there's a whole bunch of sort of EU legislation on the way around, preventing product level greenwashing and so on. For us, this looks like reasonable expected evolution of the tools. Now that, again, that they're kind of being used at a broader scale, comparability, credibility needs to be kind of more thoroughly addressed. And I think the market is reacting to that fairly quickly. So I think we're fairly comfortable with the way that these tools are evolving. And I think continuing to use them, particularly at the product level, to understand the benefits of the new stuff coming to market is really essential. I mean, they're really the best way to get a read on that, and then you can start communicating to potential buyers what these new technology benefits are. That's extremely useful.
Yeah. Okay, great. And you mentioned policy there, and we were talking a little bit offline with regards to the role of the Chinese government and, the policies that they've set. You mentioned the EU. Are you happy with the direction that policies are taking? Do governments need to do more to support businesses or to kind of level the playing field, to standardize the approach? Or is the onus on businesses to kind of step up and take the lead?
No, we're not happy with policy at all.
Okay.
It's way too slow on carbon, especially in Asia, right? So I think Asian governments have been really slow to regulate, and I think it makes it harder for businesses to act in the absence of a regulatory signal. Either they have to guess what regulations are going to come, which is tricky, or they have to find a way of doing it without regulations, right? Which is also, means you've got to be really confident about investors or customers or cost savings or whatever to make those commitments then. So no, absolutely not. A government should have done a ton more than they have. And that's part of the reason we're in the state that we're in, sort of desperately trying to get to 1.5 degrees. But, on a slightly more positive note, we do expect that to shift in Asia. We're going to see more sort of direct regulation from the China government around implementing the 2060 sort of carbon neutrality goal, and we expect that to push into sort of sector-specific rules and regulations, some of which should start emerging this year. Carbon markets, renewable energy regulations, specific regulations on buildings, probably energy efficiency, goals for intensive industries, this kind of thing. We're anticipating that this will come in China, and we think that then has a knock-on effect in the rest of the region, as other governments kind of look at this stuff and go, well, we should be doing this ourselves. So we're hoping, for an acceleration in Asian government response. We're hoping for much more direct regulation on carbon. We need the customers that are doing a great job on this to visibly benefit versus those that aren't, right? Yeah. If a business can't see the benefits from a guy that's doing nothing, then, as a business, they'll really likely to pull back. Yeah. So we will really want to see daylight between the people that have taken this seriously, and we hope that the regulations can evolve in a way that delivers that.
Okay, thank you. So, you've worked with a number of SAC members, like CNA, Ralph Lauren, Gap, and M&S, through the collaboration with AII and under the Carbon Leadership Program. Could you maybe just kind of talk to what that work looks like and how you've supported them?
Yeah, sure. So Carbon Leadership Program was sort of co-developed between Reset and AII. The primary focus of the work was to look at the wet processing hotspot that I referred to earlier. Mm-hmm. So in other words, we both organizations had identified, working with the brands that we work with, that there's this big chunk of emissions in everybody's scope 3 coming from laundries and dyeing and so on. And so the program, and actually that's not that large a number of suppliers. So it's not like hundreds and hundreds of suppliers. It's usually tens of suppliers in any kind of given supply chain that are driving a lot of these emissions. And so the program's really designed to work with brands and tier 2 suppliers to set carbon targets at the mill level, but backed with a very clear kind of technical action plan that looks at, renewables and fuel switching, coal phase out, energy efficiency options at the site. Usually puts a financial narrative around it, so the factory can see the cost savings in particular that flow from this. And then what happens is the facility will then sort of commit to a carbon target working with their brand customer. And then the brand customers can pull those carbon targets and those commitments back into their own sort of understanding of how their scope 3 emissions are going to evolve. Certainly, we don't believe that it's going to be very easy for most brands to be sourcing from carbon intensive dye mills in 2030. You're not going to be able to do much volume from a carbon intensive mill if you've got an SBTI or something like that. Yep. So it's really designed to help brands engage their supplier populations in tier 2 and move those carbon intensities down to a level where brands can continue to make volume procurements from those suppliers and keep them in the supply chain, actually. So I think, it's been successful so far in terms of over 200, suppliers participating and action plans being developed, over 25 brands, lots of overlap now coming up between, manufacturers who are supplying multiple brands, transparent, freely available methodology. You can just go get it from AII. So all the the toolkit behind it's open source, and, collaboration around a standardized technical approach makes it easier for suppliers to react because they get the same message from different customers. So I think it's ticking a lot of boxes. We want to keep scaling it, though. I think our initial goal is to get to 500 mils by 2025. And that's a big chunk of emissions if we can get there and take it further, because if we know that if we look at the sector as a whole, if we're engaging the top 1,000 mils or the top 1,500 mils or something like that, we're going to be getting a big chunk of the emissions from the whole sector actually covered by some kind of program. So it's going really well, and we're getting excellent collaboration and lots of learnings, and it's driving now into how do we support suppliers to do this. And that, leads to a whole set of other initiatives. So, it's very positive, that program.
Yeah, no, it sounds very exciting. Okay, so, the SAC is set to publish its decarbonisation guide for members, which I think Reset has been involved in. So these guides, roadmaps, tools, however you want to refer to them, are obviously important as we help educate and share knowledge and best practices. But what do you think has to happen in order to drive the change that's needed, but also at the appropriate speed and scale?
Well, the interesting thing about footwear and apparel is a lot of people made the commitments already. So that, you go to most other sectors and you don't see that. So it really, that hurdle's done. And this is really now about making sure that people implement. And so I think, certainly the SAC's role, AII, and so on, can really support brands to understand how they can execute and develop tools and so on to support that. And again, it's for a lot of brands, this is pretty clear. It's raw materials, it's wet processing. You've got to do it at scale. You can't just engage a few suppliers. You've got to go and get the bulk of them. You should be looking at your emissions map, at your hotspots, and you should have a plan to engage into that. So it's not, I think technically becoming more straightforward. It's really then about sort of business ambition. And are you engaging enough suppliers or enough raw material suppliers fast enough? And, are you on track to get the reductions that you need? So I think a lot of the SAC's role really is holding people's feet to the fire, right? The commitments are already out there. Reporting requirements are going to increase anyway. Mm-hmm. It's not going to look good for the sector if half the fashion chart and brands fail to meet their targets, right? And so I think that, or whatever the number is, but I think that's the thing we need to keep our eye on collectively, right? The sector looks actually really good right now compared to a lot of other sectors because of this level of commitment. In order to kind of keep that visibility and status almost as a consumer goods leader in some ways, we now got to make sure that the action is really happening.
Yeah. Okay, great. So Liam, I'm conscious of time and this has been really interesting and we could talk for ages, I'm sure. But if I could just get one final thought from you, are you optimistic? And if there was one thing you wanted to see, kick into high gear next week, what would it be?
I am optimistic that we can hit 2030 goals with a large percentage of companies in this sector. We need to accelerate, but a lot of the early work has been done. I don't know what I would like to see. I'd love to see, the EU border adjustment coming in earlier and kind of sending a bit of a market signal there that there's going to be a carbon price on carbon intensive imported products. So, that's going to come to apparel eventually, but it's not really in anybody's thinking right now. Once that kind of those kind of cost numbers start to hit people's business cases, everybody will again relook and double down on a lot of this stuff. So it would be great if we could get a bit of earlier regulation just to kind of speed things up. It's really all about speed. I think everybody now knows knows where they need to go. The question is, are we going to be moving fast enough?
Excellent. Thank you for that. Liam, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for your time. And yeah, enjoy the rest of your stay in Hong Kong.
Thanks, Lee. Pleasure talking to you. Bye.
Thank you for listening today. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed in this episode, please check out the links or visit www.apparelcoalition.org. Thanks again, and look forward to seeing you on our next episode. Bye for now.